Okay, everybody, here is the next chapter in our story. It's chapter 16, Two Miracles and a Mercy. And when we left off, they had just gotten word that Tansy was going to have her observation where they decide if she can continue being a teacher. They had cleaned up the school, and then Russell and Glenn decided they needed to clean out the stove. And Glenn tossed some gunpowder in it to do it quickly, and it kind of blew up and sent soot all over the classroom. Okay. By 9 o'clock, a miracle had taken place. As the pupils got here to find Tansy in what looked like a coal mine, a broken woman, they fell too. Even Pearl scooped a little soot. Little Britches turned back her small sleeves to dust Teacher's desk. Charlie wasn't entirely broke up to see Glenn's sorry state, and he put the stove back together. Of course, me and Glenn naturally did the work of 10, sweeping, polishing, fitting up the stovepipe, busy as bees and good as gold. Still, for years after, Tansy swore I'd tried to blow Hominy Ridge School off the face of the earth just to ruin her chances. She was deaf to reason, even when Glenn explained time and again we were only rushing to clean out the stovepipe. Once the schoolroom looked like its old self, me and Glenn went out to stick our heads under the pump. Big, scorched shreds of our shirts came away with the soot. Only the bibs on our overalls preserved our modesty. "Do I got any eyebrows?" asked Glenn, coming up a gasp from the freezing water. "Not a whisker," I said. "Me?" "Nothing," Glenn said. "Over your eyes, you're as smooth as lard." Still, we'd all made a miracle. At 9 o'clock sharp, Tansy sent Floppy Ears Lumley out to ring the tower bell to begin school, although we were all already there. Nobody was out sick. It was way too big a day to miss. When he got as far as the coat room, Flop Ears yelped with fear and surprise. "What now?" Tansy murmured. We all turned to see Aunt Fanny Hamline filling up the door frame. She advanced on us in her coal scuttle bonnet. In one hand was her cane, in the other a furled flag. We shrank. "State your business," said Tansy, near the end of her rope already. "Is this a public schoolroom?" Aunt Fanny snapped, "or ain't it?" "It is," we all sighed. "Is this the day the superintendent of schools is coming, or not?" "It is," we all mumbled. "Then you need an American flag." Aunt Fanny brandished her flag, and the stars and stripes unfurled above us. "This is the same flag my husband, Mr. Hamline, carried into the battle at Chickamauga," Aunt Fanny proclaimed. "3 rebel mini balls went through it, but it has stood up right well." She held it high and gave it a shake. A shaft of sunlight struck through the repolished windows to catch the tattered flag's colors. Tansy's eyes filled, but she drew herself up and reached for her pointer. "Thank you, Aunt Fanny. It's just what we needed, and it's better than a new one." Aunt Fanny waved away her thanks and turned on her heel. She stumped out, taking a swing with her cane at JW as she turned into the morning light. Charlie put Lester on his shoulder to plant the flag up in its holder. It hung proudly over President Roosevelt and Alton B. Parker's photo pictures. We were looking good now, like an actual schoolroom, and I knew at last where I stood. She could believe me or believe me not, but what I most wanted in the world was to see Tansy succeed. Why she hankered to be a teacher, I couldn't tell you. But she had chalk dust in her veins, and she deserved to get that certificate. It was only fair. We heard the jingle of harness outside, and voices. "On your feet for the Pledge of Allegiance," Tansy said with a catch in her voice. "Quick!" 2 figures loomed into the schoolroom. We scrambled up and turned our innocent faces to the flag. Behind us, our visitors had to stand stock still with their doffed derby hats over their hearts. This slowed them down, but we soon came with liberty and justice for all. "Amen," Floppier said, confusing this with church. 2 men, duded up in town clothes, marched down through us to the rostrum. The one in the lead was a stout party, balder than any egg. He put out a soft pink hand to Tansy, saying, "T. Bernard Whipple, Park County Superintendent of Schools. This here is my assistant, Mr. Owen." Mr. Owen had a good head of hair on him and wasn't half as big around as T. Bernard Whipple. He was a young man and altogether a more modern figure, in low shoes. He offered his hand, and Tansy's lingered in it. We watched. Mr. Whipple and his assistant superintendent set aside their overcoats and unfolded forms they meant to fill out. Tansy held her ground, a step above them on the rostrum. Her chin was firm, but her eyes were far from certain. "Without further ado, we will begin," the superintendent boomed. "If you have no objections, Miss Culver." "None whatever," Tansy said in a faded voice. "Your age?" "A lady never gives it," Tansy remarked. "But a teacher must." How, for example, would we know when you were old enough to draw your pension? And a pension, guys, is when you're old enough to be retired and they pay you. Not that it need to come to that, Mr. Owen blurted, meaning Tansy might marry and be saved before she was pensioned off. I'll tell you right now, Mr. Owen couldn't take his eyes off her. I wondered if this worked for her or against her. I'm 17, Tansy said. You're a native-born American citizen, the superintendent inquired. Better than that, Tansy replied with spirit. I am Hoosier-born and in Park County. The brooch she inherited from our mother was at her throat to close her collar. It winked in the morning. The superintendent and his assistant nodded. So far, so good. And now, to your general knowledge. Us pupils held our breath. How general was her knowledge? On the subject of geography, what is the highest elevation in the state of Indiana? Search us. Did she know? Tansy stroked her brooch, recalled, and spoke in a clear voice. Weed Patch Hill at 1,186 feet above sea level in Brown County, known as the Everest of Indiana. Excellent, Mr. Owen said. Right on the money. But the superintendent wasn't so pleased. And now, to not waste time, we move right along to the subject of grammar. We all paled, but Tansy never blinked. What is a participle? Does it ever part with its verbal significance? Does it assert action? Us pupils hadn't gotten to participles, whatever they may be. Had Tansy? Yes, she told them all about the participle, although myself, I followed little of her reasoning. It was some kind of verb that didn't really act like one. Tansy even explained how you better never let your participle dangle. Beautifully explained, Mr. Owen said. Superintendent Whipple shot him with a look of irritation. Miss Culver, he said, you will agree that the greatest living poet is James Whitcomb Riley, now of Indianapolis, the Athens of America, Tansy interjected. Quite so, but the first truly Indiana poetic masterpiece is universally considered to be The Hoosier's Nest, Tansy rapped out, by John Finley, 1830. Miss Culver, Mr. Owen said, you wouldn't know a line or two of that poem, would you by chance? Tansy was directing all her answers straight at him now. She cupped her hand and burst into verse. One side was lined with diverse garments, the other spread with skins of varmints. Dried pumpkins overhead were strung, where venison hams in plenty hung. 2 rifles placed above the door, 3 dogs lay stretched upon the floor. In short, the domicile was rife with specimens of Hoosier life. Mr. Owen caught his breath. A truly professional rendering, Miss Culver. I've not heard better elocution on the professional stage. Not in Muncie, Miss Culver. Not in Fort Wayne. Tansy blushed slightly and cast her eyes down. I personally thought things were going better than expected. If she could just keep them busy with her answers, maybe they'd never get around to testing us pupils. We were all quiet as mice. Ahead of me, Lloyd grew smaller and smaller there between Lester and Flop Ears. But after a question or two about arithmetic that went over my head, Mr. Whipple drew a big handkerchief from under his coattails and said, I think we've heard sufficient from the teacher. But what has she taught? He gave his nose a big honk, and we all shrank further. Lloyd was practically a dot in the distance. It is high time we trained our sights on a few of the pupils. T. Bernard Whipple turned on us. Mr. Owen dragged his eyes off Tansy. Suddenly, she swept her skirts around him and swept down the rostrum, making for Pearl. She reached out and grabbed Pearl's nose between 2 of her knuckles. Pearl's eyes bugged out, and she went an ugly beet red. But by and by, she had to open her mouth to breathe. Then, quicker than the eye, Tansy stuck a finger in her mouth and hooked out the chewing gum. She flung the gum in the stove and resumed her stance, straightened her skirts, and folded her hands before her, so they could see she was on top of things, or at least on top of Pearl. Little Britches cleared her throat noisily. When the superintendent and the assistant had turned on us, they'd turned their backs to her. She didn't like it. They looked back and noticed her for the first time, small in the big chair. Her nose just cleared teacher's desk. Her hair was in curls because this wasn't just any day. She looked up beady-eyed at them. Well then, little lady, Mr. Whipple boomed, what might you be doing sitting in the teacher's chair? Helping her? And I take it this is your first year of school? Yep. And what's your name? Beulah Bradley, Little Britches said. And how old are you? A lady don't tell them, Tansy said. 6. And do you know your letters yet? T. Bernard Whipple hung over her, big as a house. G is for the gopher digging in its burrow, Little Britches remarked. H is for the patient horse plowing in its furrow. Beside me, Glenn nodded in agreement. Ah, said the superintendent, can you put the letters together into words? Little Britches took up her complimentary writing pad from the Overland Automobile Company and began making big letters with her complimentary pencil. Her tongue escaped the side of her mouth as she labored, and at last she held up the pad. It read, hold on. So she held up the pad and it read, "See the fat man." We stirred, but nobody dared break silence. Tansy looked aside. Mr. Owen's jaw trembled. He spoke suddenly. "You're a regular scholar, Beulah. In 2 or 3 years, you'll be learning your multiplication tables." 6 8s are 48, Little Britches mentioned. Mr. Owen stared down at her. "You know your multiplication tables already?" 12 12s are 144, Little Britches pointed out. Mr. Whipple simmered. His ears burned red against his pink head. "Miss Culver, the child is only in first grade. The multiplication tables don't come until—" "I am here to help her learn," Tansy said, "not to keep her from it. She is the brightest button in the box, and what the others learn, she picks up." The superintendent jabbed a note on his form with his pencil. He looked out upon us for another victim, and we rode low in our desks. "The capital of Missouri is Jefferson City." I had drilled into my head in case I get geography. I was racking my brain for Oregon's capital when the hard Whipple eye fell on me, but it bounced back and forth between me and Charlie and then jumped to Glenn. Glenn. The superintendent had gone from the youngest of us to the oldest, from the smartest to the— "Young man, you look of an age to have profited by a great deal of schooling." Glenn just sat there. "Come down here and demonstrate what you know." We all stared at the floor. Tansy, too. What schooling Glenn had mastered wasn't going to keep us long. He came out of the desk, long-legged and fully grown. The black rags of his ruined shirt clung to his heavy shoulders. He started down to the superintendent. But on his way, Glenn swung past the wall and grabbed up Teacher's broom. Was he going to sweep out the place? My head swam. Down front, Glenn swiped at the ceiling with the broom, and the mud dauber's nest broke loose from a rafter and fell into his hands. Stray bits of nest hung in the air and settled on the superintendent's bald head. "This here's science," Glenn said, and broke open the nest with his big hands. It fell apart on Teacher's desk, and Little Britches peered into it. The mud dauber's nest was untenanted. The wasps had long ago grown and flown, but here was where they'd started out life. "You see these here cells like a comb of honey?" Glenn pointed them out. "The mother mud dauber lays an egg or two in every one of them cells. Then she goes to work and stings a spider with her poison. She don't kill that spider, but she stuns it. Then she sticks that spider in the cell with the egg and shuts it up tight. As the eggs hatch, they got plenty of spider meat to feed them on, and that's how the mud dauber wasp starts out life." We were all silenced by this knowledge. It wasn't school learning from Tansy, of course. All she knew about the life of the mud dauber she had just now learned. But Glenn was a country boy. Few of nature's ways were mysteries to him. On the other hand, the superintendent and the assistant were town men. Rockville. "You learned that at school?" the superintendent inquired. Glenn shrugged. "Where else would I have learned it?" "Well, I am glad to see that the study of natural science is not neglected," Mr. Whipple admitted. "But, son, tell me this. Why do you look so surprised? Didn't you know we were coming?" "I ain't surprised, mister," Glenn replied. "I just don't have no eyebrows." He turned back to his seat, and we all heaved with relief. That was just before T. Bernard Whipple's gaze fell on Flop Ears. I was myself pretty near the end of my rope now. It didn't seem fair. If there was anybody worse to call on than Glenn, it was— "Boy," Superintendent Whipple barked, "what's your long suit?" "Who, me?" Flop Ears pointed to himself. "My what?" "Come down here and show us what you've mastered. I take it you're not another scholar of the mud dauber?" "Of the what?" Flop Ears was stumped. He took up his complimentary notepad and wandered down to the rostrum. Now Flop Ears' head was there between the superintendent and the assistant. Tansy stood back, pity in her eyes, and dread. "Well, son, tell us. What are you best at, numbers or letters?" Flop Ears tried to think. "Is them my only choices?" He flipped open his notepad on Teacher's desk. "I reckon I like pictures best." The superintendent and the assistant bent over Flop Ears' notebook. Little Britches, too. Mr. Whipple turned to a new page. They all looked closer, and Tansy drew near. Then somehow we were all on our feet, drifting down to see what was on Flop Ears' notebook's pages. They were pictures he'd drawn with his complimentary pencil, pictures like we had never seen. They ought to have been in frames. There was one of Aunt Fanny in the ditch, and all of us trying to heave her out with the bell rope, and you could see it was Aunt Fanny, bigger than a church debt, and all of us. There was the big bow on the back of Pearl's head, and Lester's Buster Brown collar, and me, back when I had eyebrows. Mr. Owen turned a page, and there was a portrait of Tansy, and in one arm Little Britches with her face turned to Tansy's chest, and in Tansy's other hand the garter snake coiled with its tail hanging down. "That's me." Little Britches poked a small finger at the page. "It was the time that we were studying natural history," Tansy said. "Herpetology. That's the study of reptiles." Flop Ears had even done a scene of the first day of school way back in August. We were all racing out of the schoolhouse, JW2, barking his fool head off. In the distance, the boys' privy blazed like a torch. You could just about smell it. "Lightning," me and Charlie said together. "You could have knocked us over with feathers." Flop Ears had captured us all in his notebook, and we were so real we almost strolled off the page. We'd gotten him wrong. He wasn't a dunce. He was an artist. According to these pages, he saw us all a good deal clearer than we'd ever seen him. T. Bernard Whipple cleared his throat. "I am glad to know," he said, "that the study of art has not been neglected." With that, the superintendent and his assistant folded up their forms and reached for their overcoats. It was done with, and there was no doubt in our minds that Tansy had passed her trial. Another miracle, and a mercy, too, since me and Lloyd never had to be called on. So there is some justice in this world, although not a lot.